Hi, I'm your guest host, Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in Washington, D.C. for a meeting with its own nickname, the Three Amigos Summit. This is when Canada, the U.S., and Mexico get together and talk out North American relations. The first one was about 20 years ago when things were a little more friendly. But now, protectionism is on the rise. Trudeau will meet with U.S. President Joe Biden and Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And since Canada's parliament is resuming next week, Trudeau's going to want to have some wins to show from the meeting.
Despite the fact that, he and Biden, I think, are sort of aligned in kind of a big picture sense and I think get along, quite well on a personal level, Trudeau has not had much traction getting what he wants from Joe Biden on the sorts of things that Trudeau would see as victories.
Adrian Morrow is the Globe and Mail's U.S. correspondent based in Washington. He'll tell us what Canada is looking for from the summit and just how much cooperation we can expect to see between the leaders. This is The Decibel. Adrian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So leaders are meeting later today, and it's the first time a Three Amigos Summit has been held since 2016. President Donald Trump was not a fan of these get-togethers. What do you think the tone will be at this one?
I think certainly between Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau, the tone is going to be fairly friendly. I mean, and they appear to have pretty good sort of personal chemistry. We'll remember at the very end of 2016, one of Biden's last foreign trips, he came to Canada and he basically told Justin Trudeau, you have to be kind of the leading light of the international liberal order, in the kind of dark days of Donald Trump that were coming up at that point.
The world's going to spend a lot of time looking to you, Mr. Prime Minister, as we see more and more challenges to the liberal international order than any time since the end of World War II.
Let's just take a step back for a moment. Why is this North American summit important for these three leaders?
This is basically going to be, number one, sort of a forum for, them sort of building a rapport and trying to sort of reestablish, a relationship. Number two, it's going to be an opportunity for Trudeau to sort of press Joe Biden on some of the kind of bilateral irritants in the two countries. So despite the fact that, he and Biden, I think, are sort of aligned in kind of a big picture sense and I think get along, quite well on a personal level, Trudeau has not had much traction getting what he wants from Joe Biden on the sorts of things that Trudeau would see as victories.
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned the rapport between Trudeau and Biden. How important is the personal relationship between Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden to actually getting things done between Canada and the U.S.?
I think it's particularly important in the case of somebody like Joe Biden, who's like a classic kind of extroverted retail politician, and one of whose kind of signature features of his personality is that he likes to kind of please everybody. And it seems to sort of bother him when, especially people that are friendly or that are allies of his, if they're sort of unhappy. I think that actually does sort of bother Joe Biden. I think he sort of likes the idea of somehow managing to kind of please everybody.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the issues that are likely to be discussed at today's meeting. What would you say are the top three things that Trudeau is likely to bring up?
So I'd say number one is this electric vehicle tax credit that Joe Biden is backing that would basically incentivize auto companies to build as much as possible of their new electric vehicles in the U.S. as opposed to building them in Canada or Mexico. Number two would be the Buy America provisions that are in the big infrastructure package that the U.S. Congress passed and Joe Biden just signed into law earlier this week. Number three is Line 5, this oil pipeline, Canadian-owned oil pipeline that goes through Michigan and across the Straits of Mackinac.
Okay, so let's talk about Buy American first, because that's a big one. What exactly is this policy?
So it's sort of twofold. One is that Joe Biden earlier this year announced that he was going to make the Buy America thresholds for federal government procurement higher than they are now.
Now, most people don't know, no matter how informed they are, most people don't know that for literally almost a century, there's been a law on the books in America called the Buy America Act. It's supposed to make sure that when your government spends your tax dollars in buying goods, that they have to be goods that were built, purchased in America. But the previous administration didn't take it so seriously.
And then in this $1.2 trillion infrastructure package that just went through this week, mandates that the spending on these new pieces of infrastructure should substantially go to American companies. And there's a whole bunch of sort of complicated rules around that. Now, federal government spending by the U.S. is covered by this WTO protocol that Canada and the U.S. and a bunch of European countries and other countries have signed that essentially, gives Canada an exemption from those kind of policies when it's direct spending by the federal government. However, the WTO policy doesn't cover spending by local governments and only covers some spending by state governments. And a lot of this infrastructure money is basically going to be put through state and local governments, so given to them by the federal government. And so there's a huge potential for that to hurt Canadian companies.
Mm-hmm. Exactly how real would you say are Canada's fears here? Like, how much money could Canadian companies stand to lose if Biden does go forward with this Buy American agenda?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the numbers are a little bit unclear. This isn't tracked particularly well, but there is one estimate from 2015 that said about $15 billion worth of procurement spending from U.S. governments, federal, state, and local, went to Canadian companies. And out of that, about $674 million worth was from the federal government directly. There was another estimate from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that basically showed that because of, previous rounds of protectionism, I think it was less than 2% of U.S. government spending actually went to Canadian companies. The idea that less than 2% of your government procurement spending is already going to these Canadian companies, gives you some idea that these previous rounds of protectionism actually have had the effect that U.S. governments have wanted them to have, and have ensured that even Canadian companies are not really getting a huge sort of piece of the pie.
Now, of course, Trump took a protectionist stance on trade, and that's actually largely been continued under Biden. What's the political reasoning for that?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. At its highest, Buy America stuff is just always popular. It's always very popular to tell people in this country, or probably in any country, when we're spending government dollars, it's all going to go to people who live here, to companies that are based here, and it's not going to go to other countries. So another thing that motivates it is this desire, I think, by Biden and by other U.S. politicians to cut out, China and Russia and other sort of, unfriendly countries from U.S. spending. And I'd say that the sort of third factor is maybe the one that's sort of maybe more unique to Biden and to the Democrats, which is that, the Democratic Party traditionally has been quite protectionist. Some of that comes from the kind of union culture. And then on top of that, besides the sort of maybe traditional kind of blue collar Democrats and unions that favor these kind of protectionist trade policies, a lot of folks on the new left kind of favor them too. The Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and people in that vein sort of favor this economic protectionism as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Adrian, you also mentioned some electric vehicle tax credits as well that Biden has introduced. Can you tell us why Canada doesn't like those?
We are a little bit concerned about the zero-emission vehicle mandates or rebates brought forward in the current by the current proposal in Congress right now that could have a real negative impact on the auto pack. But that's part of the conversations we're going to have today to make sure that people understand that doing this together is good for all of us, good for the job.
Yeah, so he's proposed an electric vehicle tax credit, and there's essentially another sort of Buy America type provision within the EV tax credits where you would only be eligible to claim those tax credits as a consumer if you were buying an electric vehicle that was made in the U.S. And given that there's this hope that electric vehicles are, going to grow enormously in the future, that's, the future of automotive transportation, it could basically set the industry up in such a way that all the infrastructure that gets built for it and that ultimately gets used for decades to come gets put in the U.S., and that Canada and Mexico are sort of cut out of those, those opportunities.
And so how might Trudeau try to convince Biden to actually ditch these credits?
So Trudeau is going to point to the integrated economy. He's going to point to the fact that, the auto industry between the three countries, is so heavily integrated. You have parts made in each country that's sent to, to other countries to be assembled. And you often have components of cars that will cross, all three borders multiple times before they actually hit the road. He'll probably also point to the fact that Canada has all these critical minerals that are used in EV batteries, and other products that the U.S. needs, and that they'd much rather be sourcing them from Canada than sourcing them from China or from other countries that the U.S. is competing with. And I think this is an argument that Biden probably intrinsically understands, and so it's one that's very, very likely to kind of land well with him. Trudeau's going to say, you take all of that together, it's much better that you do everything possible to sort of allow Canada to kind of continue to benefit from what the U.S. is doing from the spending on electric vehicles, because that's ultimately going to make the industry stronger, probably will also make EVs cheaper and will get people to buy more of them than if you sort of impose these constraints that potentially make electric vehicles more expensive by ensuring that they're manufactured entirely in the U.S.
Let's talk about the Line 5 pipeline, which the Canadian government wants, but Biden is not so enthusiastic about. So how likely is he to respond to any kind of, lobbying from Trudeau on this issue?
The Democratic Party is increasingly, concerned about climate change and increasingly sees pipelines as one of the problems. The other component is that the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, is an ally of Biden's, is one of the people opposing the pipeline and is basically trying to shut it down. And so Biden, I think, has zero interest in kind of getting in between the governor of Michigan and one of her campaign promises.
Okay. So we've gone through what Canada wants out of the summit, but what does the U.S. actually want from us?
The main thing right now, I think, would probably be making it easier to get across the border because, Canada is one of the few countries in the world that still requires a PCR test basically to cross into the country rather than the rapid tests, which are, cheaper and more sort of readily available. Coming into the U.S., you just require a rapid antigen test. Going into Canada, you require a PCR test, which is, more expensive. And then there's also sort of some other rules where the U.S. allows, if you're fully vaccinated, you can cross at the land border without having tested at all. And so I think the U.S. would like Canada to sort of lower those thresholds, basically move from a PCR test to an antigen test, and maybe basically allow fully vaccinated Americans to cross the land border without testing at all.
Just to clarify, this is a COVID-19 test for COVID-19 to cross the border then, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So we've now spent all this time talking about Canada and the U.S., but of course this is a Three Amigos Summit, and we can't forget about Mexico. Is there anything that Canada and Mexico may try to work out while at this meeting?
You might see Canada and Mexico sort of team up on the procurement stuff and on the protectionism with Biden, because the situations are slightly different in the sense that Canada has signed this WTO agreement with the U.S. and Mexico has not. And so Mexico is sort of in a worse place than Canada. But they basically are in the same position where they're both parties to the USMCA with the U.S., which was meant to sort of ensure that all this trade was flowing smoothly and that these kind of cross-border supply chains, especially in the auto sector, but also in other sectors as well, that all of that was sort of open.
And the USMCA, that's the new NAFTA deal, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I think you will see alignment between Canada and Mexico in kind of making the very same argument, I think, to Biden that, look, it basically hurts the U.S. economy, it hurts U.S. companies, and it ultimately is going to make these projects more expensive by deciding that, that you're going to focus as much spending as possible in the U.S. and cut out, Canadian and Mexican companies that are part of this integrated supply chain. Between the U.S. and Mexico, there's going to be a lot of discussion of the border. Biden is kind of walking this fine line between, on one hand, not wanting to continue the clampdown of the Trump era because, it's inhumane and it's unpopular with people who vote for him, but at the same time not wanting to be seen as being sort of soft on the border, which is, an attack that Trump has been constantly making over the last year.
So, Adrian, taking all of this together, what does a successful Three Amigos Summit look like for Justin Trudeau and also for Canada?
I think for Trudeau, the best that he could sort of hope for, I mean, I'm sure that in his wildest dreams, Trudeau imagines that Biden would come out publicly and say, okay, I'm going to issue a proclamation that says, Canadian companies are going to be exempt from all these kind of Buy America provisions and the EV tax credit will still apply if the vehicle is assembled in Canada or something along those lines. Highly unlikely Biden will do anything like that. More likely is that Biden will at least sort of commit to some sort of, process where their respective governments will talk and negotiate and sort of figure out if there's a way that they can sort of write the regulations in the U.S. to ensure that Canada doesn't get cut out from any of this kind of procurement stuff. And then it would be a huge bonus if Biden, also agreed to some sort of process that would allow, Canadian companies basically to assemble, vehicles that would qualify for the EV tax credit. Those are sort of maybe the two things where Trudeau could win victories, and I think the sort of two where it's most likely that he would.
Adrian, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and speak about this.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White and Cheryl Sutherland. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks to Adrian Morrow. You can find him on Twitter at Adrian Morrow. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at MenakaRW. You can also email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. And if you haven't already, please follow The Decibel wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.